Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Tennessee. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year recorded most often in county ledgers is 1874, a time when Tennessee was still unsettled in ways that went beyond politics. The war had ended, but order had not yet returned to the countryside. Farms changed hands quietly. Old plantations stood half-used, their labor systems disrupted, their owners unsure which rules still applied. This was the uneasy ground of the Reconstruction era, when fear often moved faster than law. It was during an unusually wet autumn that the man first appeared in local accounts. No one could say exactly where he came from. A freight handler at a rural rail stop claimed to see him step down from a cattle car at dawn, bending slightly so as not to strike his head. Others insisted he had been on the land already, working unseen for years. What everyone agreed upon was his size. Several affidavits describe him as well above any ordinary measure, with one justice of the peace noting bluntly, near 7 feet, by comparison to the door frame. His name is inconsistent across records. Some list him as Isaac, others as Elijah. A few avoid names altogether, referring only to the tall enslaved man formerly attached to the Caldwell property. That phrase appears repeatedly in tax and probate documents, long after slavery itself had been legally dismantled. Freedom on paper did not erase possession in practice. The Caldwell place sat near the edge of the Cumberland Plateau, where roads narrowed and sound traveled unpredictably. Neighbors recalled seeing the man moving through the fields at first light, carrying loads that would have required 2 men under normal circumstances. He spoke little, if at all. One overseer's note described him as quiet to the point of discomfort. Another added, "He listens more than he answers." The first disturbance was minor. A locked barn found open, tools rearranged, horses unsettled but unharmed. Caldwell himself dismissed these as accidents, until his wife began insisting that someone was standing outside the house at night. She claimed she could hear breathing at the windows, slow and measured, as if counting. County sheriffs were reluctant to intervene. There was no crime they could name, no witness willing to swear harm. Yet the unease grew. Plantation owners in neighboring districts began writing letters to one another, comparing notes. One survives in fragmentary form, stating simply, "The tall one does not threaten. That is the trouble." By the time the man was seen walking openly along the ridge road, head level with low branches, posture unhurried, the fear had shifted from rumor to certainty. Whatever his legal status, he was no longer being supervised. And those who once believed they controlled him were beginning to understand that control had quietly changed direction. The first formal complaint came not from Caldwell himself, but from a neighboring landholder, a man named Horace Wilkins, whose property bordered the old plantation by a shallow creek. Wilkins submitted an affidavit claiming that his fences had been dismantled and rebuilt overnight, posts moved several feet inward without damage. He stated plainly that no theft occurred. "It is not loss I object to," he wrote, "it is intention." Other statements followed. A mill operator reported that grain sacks had been relocated from one storage room to another, stacked higher than any single worker could reasonably reach. A farmhand swore he heard footsteps pacing his cabin roof during a storm, slow enough to be deliberate, heavy enough to bow the boards, yet leaving no visible damage by morning. Each report ended the same way. No confrontation, no threat, no explanation. The man himself was rarely spoken to directly. When he was, witnesses described his voice as low and carefully measured. A traveling preacher claimed to have asked him where he slept. The reply, recorded in a church journal years later, was unsettling in its simplicity. Where the ground holds. By early winter, Caldwell's household began to fracture. Hired workers quit without notice. One left a note saying only that the land did not belong to us anymore. Caldwell's wife relocated to her sister's home in town. Caldwell remained, insisting that no one, least of all a former slave, would drive him from his own property. Then the incident occurred that hardened fear into action. According to later testimony, Caldwell attempted to reassert authority one evening after supper. He confronted the man near the barn, accusing him of sabotage and threatening removal. No witnesses could agree on what followed. What is consistent is that Caldwell was found the next morning locked inside his own grain silo, alive but shaken, unable to explain how he had been placed there. The ladder lay neatly against the wall. The lock was secured from the outside. No charges were filed. Caldwell refused medical attention. Within a week, he sold the property at a loss and departed the county altogether. Word spread quickly. Plantation owners who had once boasted of their holdings now spoke in guarded tones. The man did not pursue them. He did not follow Caldwell. He remained on the land, tending it with the same quiet discipline as before. Crops improved. Livestock calmed. Yet no one claimed ownership anymore. A county clerk later wrote in the margin of a land transfer record, "Status unclear, occupant present, enforcement not advised." Midway through the winter, a sheriff's patrol was dispatched as a formality. They returned before nightfall. One deputy resigned the following day. When pressed, he said only, "He stands where he is, that's all." By then, the fear had changed shape. It was no longer about what the man might do. It was about what he had already demonstrated. That size alone was not the source of power, and silence could be more effective than violence. And in rural Tennessee, still adjusting to the long aftermath of the Reconstruction era, that realization carried a weight few were prepared to challenge. By the spring thaw, the man's presence had become something county officials could not easily categorize. He was no longer listed as labor, yet he had not left. He was not squatting, yet no deed named him. What unsettled those around him was not defiance, but order. The fields nearest his dwelling were the best kept. Fences repaired themselves. Storm damage was addressed before anyone asked who had done the work. Local newspapers avoided direct mention, but small items appeared between notices. Unusual quiet reported near former Caldwell tract, one line read. Another referred to a labor dispute resolved without incident, though no dispute had been publicly recorded. The implication was clear enough to those who knew. A constable named James Rutledge was tasked with reviewing the matter quietly. His notes survive only in excerpts, copied later by a courthouse clerk. Ruddle described the man as physically imposing beyond expectation, but emphasized demeanor over size. "He does not advance," Rutledge wrote. "He waits, he watches, he adjusts." Rutledge attempted a conversation, approaching the man near a spring. He later testified that the man listened fully before responding, as if weighing whether the words required answer at all. When asked why he remained on the land, the reply was brief: "Because it still remembers me." Rutledge did not press further. Rumors began to circulate beyond the county. Travelers spoke of a giant who walked ridge lines at dusk, visible for miles. Others claimed he could be heard before he was seen, not through noise, but through the way animals fell silent. These accounts were never verified. They did not need to be. Midway through the year, a ledger was discovered in a half-burned outbuilding on the Caldwell property. It contained names of workers, tallies of output, and annotations about discipline. Several entries had been crossed out with heavy strokes. One line underlined twice read, "No overseer required." The discovery prompted brief discussion among county commissioners. Some argued for removal on principle. Others noted there was no legal mechanism to enforce it without provoking a situation they could not control. The discussion ended without resolution. A doctor called to treat a neighboring farmer later noted that the man had already tended the wound before he arrived. The bandage was clean, expertly applied. The farmer insisted the man had not spoken a word, only waited until the bleeding stopped. By late summer, the case had slipped from active review into quiet acknowledgement. The man was still referred to in records obliquely: the occupant, the tall laborer, the former slave, but no action followed. Fear had settled into something closer to respect, though no one used that word aloud. And so, in the hills of Tennessee, the question was no longer whether the man would leave. It was whether anyone else would dare to take his place. As summer gave way to another long season of rain, the man's influence extended without announcement. Families living along the ridge roads began adjusting their routines. Tools left out overnight were returned to their proper places by morning. Livestock wandered farther without being lost. No one thanked anyone for these changes. Gratitude, like accusation, felt inappropriate. The first disappearance was not recorded as such. A hired hand from a neighboring farm failed to report for work. He was known for drinking and unreliability, so no alarm was raised. Days later, his belongings were found stacked neatly outside his cabin, boots cleaned, bed rolled. He was never seen again. Some said he moved west. Others said nothing at all. 2 more absences followed over the next months, men who had spoken openly about forcing the giant off the land. Their departures were quiet, leaving behind no sign of struggle. County records list them as relocated. Later testimony suggests no one believed that explanation. Sheriff correspondence from this period shows growing hesitation. One letter advises deputies not to enter the upper tract without cause that can be clearly stated and clearly concluded. Another notes that the situation was stable by unusual means. No warrants were issued. Midway through the year, a traveling surveyor attempted to measure the Caldwell land for potential resale. He abandoned the work after a single day, citing disorientation and an inability to maintain bearing. His instruments were returned to him at the edge of the property that evening, aligned carefully on a stone wall. A passing reference to the man appears in a regional report on post-war labor relations, noting instances where former laborers maintained de facto control over land due to local reluctance to intervene. No names were given, but the implication was clear to those reading closely. What unsettled observers most was the lack of escalation. No threats, no demands, no proclamations. The man did not gather followers. He did not expand territory. He remained precisely where he was, and that was enough. A neighbor later testified that he once saw the man standing in the rain at dusk, motionless, head bowed slightly as if listening to the ground itself. He wasn't guarding, the neighbor said. He was waiting. By autumn, the Caldwell Tract was no longer spoken of as contested. It was spoken of as settled. Property values around it dipped slightly, not from fear of violence, but from an unspoken agreement that certain questions were no longer worth asking. In the hills of Tennessee, where memory often outlasted law, the case slipped quietly into folklore. But the folklore did not exaggerate. It restrained itself, careful not to invite attention. Because everyone understood the same thing. The man had not taken the land by force. He had simply remained when others could not. By the close of that year, the Caldwell Tract had effectively been removed from the county's active concerns, not through decree, but through omission. Tax assessors listed it as under review. Road crews diverted around it without instruction. Even census takers marked the dwelling as occupied but declined to enter a name. Those who lived nearest adjusted first. A woman named Martha Henley, whose small holding bordered the lower field, testified years later that she began leaving her gate unlatched at night. It felt safer that way, she said, though she could not explain why. When asked if she feared theft, she replied, "No, I feared disturbance." The man himself appeared less often after that. When he did, it was at the margins, near water, at the edge of cleared ground on the ridge line at dawn. Several witnesses described the same detail independently. He never crossed into town. He watched it from above, as if measuring distance rather than intent. A schoolteacher's journal from the period contains a brief aside about children refusing to take a shortcut past the old plantation. When pressed, one child said, "That place is already counted." The teacher did not ask what was meant. County correspondence from 1875 reveals a cautious tone. A clerk noted that prior attempts to resolve the matter had produced no improvement. Another wrote that the situation should be allowed to age. The phrasing echoed broader attitudes of the Reconstruction era, when many unresolved tensions were managed through delay rather than decision. The war's end had not produced clarity, it had produced pauses. Midway through the winter, a fire damaged the remaining outbuildings on the Caldwell land. No one reported seeing flames. The ruins were discovered cold, as if the fire had been allowed to burn itself out. Among the debris, a small cache of ledgers was found, their pages damp but legible. Several entries referred to discipline quotas and output targets from years earlier. Across one page, a single line had been written later in a different hand: "No more tallies." The ledgers were archived and forgotten. In the spring that followed, a traveling physician stopped to rest near the property. He later wrote that he heard movement in the trees above him, slow and heavy, but felt no threat. It was the sound of something standing its ground, he noted. He slept undisturbed. By then, the fear associated with the man had changed shape again. It was no longer fear of harm, nor even fear of defiance. It was fear of misjudgment, of misunderstanding a balance that seemed to hold only as long as it was not tested. No formal manhunt was ever authorized. No warrant issued. The man's size, once the focus of every account, became incidental. What mattered was his consistency. He did not expand. He did not retreat. He endured. And so the case entered its longest phase, not as an open conflict but as a quiet accommodation. In Tennessee, where the land itself carried memory, the arrangement felt older than the records that described it. Those who passed the ridge road at dusk still avoided looking up, not because they expected to see him, but because they understood that seeing was not required. As the seasons turned, the Caldwell land began to acquire a reputation that did not rely on story alone. It was spoken of in practical terms. Farmers noted that storms broke differently over that ridge. Hunters observed that game avoided the lower fields but gathered in the woods above, as if aware of a boundary that could not be seen. No one argued these observations. They were treated as facts, like changes in soil or water. By 1876, the man was rarely described as frightening in direct terms. Instead, he was called fixed. That word appears in two separate letters from different officials, neither of whom explained what they meant by it. One wrote that the situation was fixed enough to leave alone. The other noted that any attempt to intervene would likely unfix something that currently held. A traveling journalist attempted to investigate the rumors and was turned back repeatedly. Guides offered alternative routes without hesitation. One finally told him, "There's nothing there you can print without trouble." The journalist left the county with no story and a sense of having been politely refused by the land itself. Fragments of testimony from this period suggest the man's habits had narrowed. He was seen most often near water sources and old fence lines, places where boundaries naturally formed. He carried no visible weapon anymore. Several witnesses remarked on his hands, broad, scarred, but steady. They looked like hands that had learned when not to move, one neighbor recalled. A constable named Edwin Price attempted to reopen the file quietly, citing unresolved property questions. He visited the ridge alone and returned before dusk, pale and unsettled. He wrote only one sentence in the margin of the case record: "Presence acknowledged, authority declined." He requested reassignment shortly thereafter. Late that year, a group of laborers attempted to reclaim timber from the upper tract without permission. Their wagon broke an axle on the ascent. By morning, the axle had been repaired and the wagon repositioned facing downhill. No one was present. The laborers left without collecting their tools. The man was never seen during that incident, yet his involvement was assumed without discussion. This was the pattern now. His actions were inferred from outcomes, not encounters. As winter approached again, county business shifted to other matters. The Caldwell tract was not mentioned in annual reviews. It had become administratively invisible, which in that era was often the most stable condition a disputed place could reach. And so, in the high ground of Tennessee, the man continued to exist without record or resistance. He did not demand recognition. He did not seek redress. He remained silent, immovable, and increasingly inseparable from the land itself. By the time another year had passed, the story no longer advanced in events but in silences. What had once required explanation now required only memory. The man's figure, when mentioned at all, appeared in conversation like a fixed landmark, something accounted for without being approached. A county survey conducted in 1877 listed the Caldwell Tract as undeveloped due to local conditions. No further detail was provided. The phrase appeared nowhere else in the document. When questioned later, the surveyor said he had copied it from an older margin note whose author he could not recall. Those who lived nearby learned to read small signs. A gate left open meant passage was permitted. A gate closed without lock meant it was not. These cues were never explained, yet they were followed with consistency that suggested agreement rather than fear. Children raised in the area absorbed these rules early, without being told who enforced them. A retired overseer, interviewed years later, admitted that the man frightened him more after he stopped appearing. When he was there, you knew where you stood, he said. When he wasn't, you wondered why. The overseer never returned to the ridge after leaving the county. Occasionally, travelers claimed to glimpse a tall figure at great distance, standing against the tree line at dawn or dusk. Such sightings were never confirmed. They were also never denied. The uncertainty became part of the arrangement. Midway through that year, a fire destroyed several older record books in the courthouse basement. Among the losses were labor registers and disciplinary logs from before the war. The clerk noted the damage as regrettable but unavoidable. No effort was made to reconstruct what was lost. The absence seemed to settle matters rather than complicate them. The man's age became a subject of speculation. Some said he must have been slowing by then. Others insisted he remained unchanged, that the mountains preserved him differently. No one could say with certainty. No one tried to find out. What endured was the effect. Disputes near the ridge resolved themselves quickly. Trespass declined. Violence remained low. The presence, real or assumed, continued to regulate behavior without visible enforcement. And so the case moved further from its origin. The escape that had begun it was no longer relevant. The fear that followed had matured into habit. The man himself had become less an individual than a principle, proof that endurance, once established, could replace authority entirely. In Tennessee, where land and memory often intertwined, that principle held firm. The ridge remained quiet. The fields remained ordered. And the question of what might happen if the balance were tested again went unasked, left to settle into the soil like everything else that no longer required words. By 1877, the situation surrounding the Caldwell Tract had reached a peculiar kind of permanence. No proclamation marked it. No agreement formalized it. Yet every official action, or lack of one, reinforced the same conclusion. The land and the man upon it were no longer to be interfered with. County minutes from that year include a brief exchange regarding road maintenance. A proposal to widen a ridge route was discussed, then quietly redirected elsewhere. The reason given was terrain difficulty. though earlier surveys showed no such obstacle. A clerk later noted in his private journal that the difficulty was not physical. "It is occupancy," he wrote, then crossed the word out. Residents closest to the tract began speaking less about fear and more about certainty. One farmer remarked that storms seemed to break before reaching the upper fields. Another claimed his cattle no longer strayed uphill, even when feed was scarce. These observations were shared without emphasis, as if they were weather patterns rather than warnings. The man himself appeared only intermittently now. When he did, witnesses described him as older but unchanged in posture, still upright, still deliberate. A woman collecting water from a spring claimed he stood aside to let her pass, nodding once without expression. She told no one until years later, explaining that the moment felt private. A regional newspaper attempted to summarize unresolved labor disputes in post-war Tennessee and included a single sentence referring to an isolated case of de facto land control by a former laborer. The sentence drew no response and was never expanded upon in later editions. Late that year, a group of timber speculators attempted to assess the value of the upper ridge. They returned before dusk, refusing to speak in detail. One man later admitted that they felt noticed too early. The phrase appeared again in another account months later, spoken by someone else who had never met him. By winter, the ridge roads were avoided almost entirely. Not blocked, avoided. There was no sense of urgency in the decision. It was simply understood. And so the story continued to compress, not into legend but into routine. The man no longer needed to be seen to be present. His size, once the focus of every account, mattered less than the effect he had left behind. In the hills of Tennessee, that effect was unmistakable. Authority had learned where it ended, and no one was eager to test whether it could be moved again. By the time 1878 settled over the high country, the ridge had become something like a fixed silence. It was no longer discussed in county meetings, not because it had been resolved, but because it had ceased to invite motion. What could not be adjusted was left alone. A school inspector traveling through the district recorded an unusual pattern. Attendance dropped sharply during weeks when lessons required children to pass near the old Caldwell land. Parents offered vague explanations, whether chores, sickness, but the inspector noticed the absences followed no storm or seasonal labor. They followed the ridge. A former deputy, now employed as a clerk, wrote privately that the man's presence had altered behavior without announcement. No one enforces it, he noted, yet everyone complies. He compared it to gravity, felt constantly, argued never. Late that summer, a body was discovered near a creek several miles from the tract. The death was ruled accidental, but whispers spread quickly, linking it to the mountain man. The coroner's report showed no signs of violence. Still, the rumor persisted, not because evidence supported it, but because fear sought an anchor. Within weeks, the rumor faded. It did not fit the pattern. Witnesses who claimed to see the man during this period described him standing at elevation, never below. He was seen watching valley movement from above, never interfering, never descending. One traveler said it felt less like surveillance and more like confirmation, as if the man needed only to know that things remained as expected. A traveling historian researching labor transitions during the Reconstruction era passed briefly through the county. He noted the case obliquely, referring to an anomalous instance where former power structures inverted without recorded violence. He mentioned Tennessee's uplands as particularly resistant to formal explanation. His notes were never published in full. County maintenance logs show repeated repairs to ridge markers, stones knocked over and later reset with care. No one admitted responsibility. No one questioned the result. As autumn returned, hunters reported that game paths shifted once again, avoiding lower clearings and clustering higher up. The land seemed to respond not to settlement, but to restraint. The man himself remained unseen for months at a time, yet his absence did not weaken the effect. If anything, it strengthened it. People spoke more carefully. They chose words and routes with intention. By the end of the year, the ridge no longer felt watched. It felt accounted for. And in Tennessee, where order often emerged without declaration, that accounting proved enough to hold through another winter, untouched and unquestioned. The winter that followed was mild, but it carried a weight that could not be measured by weather alone. Snow dusted the upper ridges briefly, then melted, leaving the land exposed and quiet. Those who lived nearby remarked that the silence felt settled, not expectant, as if something had already been decided. In early 1879, a county clerk named William Proctor attempted to consolidate unresolved files from the previous decade. When he reached the folder associated with the Caldwell tract, he hesitated. His later notes suggest the hesitation was not administrative. "There is nothing to add," he wrote, "only repetition." The folder was returned to storage without alteration. A preacher assigned temporarily to the district made an effort to visit isolated households along the ridge. He later confessed to abandoning the route halfway through. He described a sensation of being evaluated rather than threatened. "It felt," he said, "as though I had arrived without permission, though no gate barred the way." Occasional travelers still reported glimpses of a tall figure at distance, never close enough to confirm, never near enough to approach. These accounts appeared in letters and diaries, not in affidavits. No one sought verification. The sightings functioned less as evidence and more as reassurance that the arrangement remained intact. One incident briefly disturbed the calm. A group of speculators from out of state attempted to purchase land near the ridge, dismissing local cautions as superstition. They erected survey stakes and marked trees with fresh paint. Within a week, the markers were gone. The trees stood unharmed. The men withdrew quietly, later stating that the investment no longer felt sound. The man himself was not seen during this episode. His involvement was assumed without comment. It was the absence of confrontation that confirmed the pattern. Medical records from a nearby town show no unusual injuries during that winter. No assaults, no disappearances. Whatever fear remained did not express itself through violence. It expressed itself through avoidance. By spring, the ridge had once again faded from discussion. The land was left as it had been, neither reclaimed nor abandoned. The man, whether present or not, continued to exert influence without effort. And so the story moved further from its beginning. The escape that once defined it had dissolved into something quieter and more durable, a condition of restraint shared by all who lived near the high ground. In Tennessee, where memory often settled into the landscape itself, the ridge held steady, unchanged, unchallenged and still quietly refusing explanation. By the time the 1880s arrived, the ridge had become administratively invisible. It appeared on maps, but it no longer appeared in plans. County improvements bypassed it without discussion. When budgets were drawn, the area was treated as complete, as though nothing further could be done there. A regional agricultural report from 1881 praised surrounding counties for stability, but noted in an aside that certain upland tracts require no oversight. The phrase stood out to one reader, a former magistrate who later wrote that oversight was usually withdrawn only after repeated failure. His letter was never answered. The man was mentioned less frequently now, and when he was, it was without urgency. A storekeeper recalled seeing him once at dawn, standing at the edge of the tree line, taller than memory but thinner, as if the years had refined rather than reduced him. He did not enter the store. He did not need to. Children raised near the ridge developed an instinctive understanding of distance. They played freely until they reached a certain line, then turned back without instruction. Parents noticed this and said nothing. "They learn early," one mother remarked. "Same as we did." A traveling physician passing through the area noted an unusual calm among upland residents. Injuries were treated promptly. Disputes rarely escalated. He wrote that the community seemed governed by anticipation rather than reaction, a concept he could not explain medically. Occasional rumors persisted, that the man had died, that he had moved on, that he was no longer alone. None were confirmed. None altered behavior. The ridge remained unchanged. Late that year, a violent storm tore through the lower valleys, damaging homes and crops. The upper tract was spared. When aid wagons passed nearby, they did not turn uphill. No one suggested they should. By then, the story had lost its need for witnesses. It functioned without them. The man's size, once the most remarked-upon detail, had become irrelevant. What mattered was the space he held, and the fact that it continued to hold. In Tennessee's high country, where authority often dissolved into terrain, the ridge remained settled not by law or force, but by long familiarity with a presence that no longer required proof. As the decade advanced, the ridge entered what officials later called its quiet years. No disturbances were reported, not because nothing occurred, but because nothing demanded response. The absence of urgency became the defining feature of the place. In 1883, a state-appointed land appraiser attempted to standardize records across the region. His survey included the ridge by necessity, but his final report reduced the area to a single line: occupied, stable, non-transferable. The wording was unusual. When questioned, the appraiser said only that further clarification felt unnecessary. A local historian collecting oral accounts during this period noted that references to the man no longer included fear. Instead, they carried a tone of caution mixed with inevitability. "He is there," one farmer said. "He has always been there, long enough that it doesn't matter when he arrived." Occasional travelers continued to report sensations rather than sightings, feeling observed without seeing anyone, sensing movement without sound. These reports were inconsistent and unverifiable. They were also remarkably similar in phrasing, despite coming from people who had never met. One incident briefly disturbed the calm when a pair of hunters strayed too far uphill during a fog. They returned hours later, shaken but unharmed, unable to agree on where they had been. Their rifles were unloaded, cleaned, and leaning against a tree when they found them again. Neither man chose to hunt the ridge after that day. County correspondence from the mid-1880s shows a deliberate avoidance of the area. A clerk wrote that the ridge settles itself. Another added, "We would only interfere." The man himself had become almost entirely abstract. His age, health, and whereabouts were unknown, yet the pattern he had established remained intact. Boundaries were respected, trespass declined. Order persisted without enforcement. By the end of the year, the case existed only as a shape, an outline formed by years of consistent behavior. It no longer required explanation. It required memory. And in Tennessee, where land often carried history more faithfully than paper, the ridge continued to hold its place, silent, accounted for, and still quietly resistant to inquiry. By the late 1880s, the ridge had become something inherited rather than remembered. New families moved into the lower valleys without ever being told its history. They learned instead by observation, by which paths were used, which ones were not, and which questions received no answer. A county school report from 1886 noted that children from upland districts displayed an unusual awareness of boundaries. When asked to draw maps, they marked the ridge clearly but left it unlabeled. The teacher who submitted the report remarked that the omission appeared deliberate. No follow-up was requested. An aging surveyor, reviewing his own earlier work, wrote that the measurements near the high ground never felt complete. "The land resists precision," he said, echoing language that had appeared decades earlier in unrelated files. He retired soon after, leaving the notes unpublished. Occasional artifacts surfaced: an old walking stick found near a spring, a pair of boots left neatly beneath a tree. None could be conclusively dated. None were claimed. Each discovery prompted brief discussion, then silence. The items were either returned to the land or stored and forgotten. The man's name, if it had ever been agreed upon, was no longer spoken. People referred to him indirectly, if at all. "The one above," some said. Others simply gestured toward the ridge. The effect was the same. Understanding passed without language. A traveling lecturer speaking on post-war social order mentioned Tennessee's uplands as an example of informal equilibrium. He did not cite causes. He did not name individuals. Yet several listeners recognized the reference immediately and said nothing. By then, even fear had thinned. What remained was caution shaped by time. The ridge was not dangerous. It was resolved. As another winter approached, snow dusted the higher ground and vanished by midday. No tracks were seen. No absence was noted. The land appeared exactly as it was expected to appear. And so the story continued without event. The man, whether still living or long absorbed into the hills, no longer needed to act. The boundaries he established held on their own. In Tennessee, where history often settled into practice rather than record, the ridge remained what it had become decades earlier, a place acknowledged without being approached and remembered without being named. By the early 1890s, the ridge no longer appeared in conversation as a place where something had happened, but as a place where things simply did not happen anymore. No new disputes emerged from it. No claims were filed. No authority tested its boundaries. The absence of incident became its most reliable feature. A professor from a small Tennessee college visited the county while collecting material on post-war labor patterns. His private notes, later quoted by a former student, describe the ridge as an example of authority dissolved into geography. He remarked that whatever conflict once existed there had resolved not through law, but through endurance. The observation was never expanded upon in his published work. Local folklore shifted again during this period, growing quieter rather than more dramatic. Children were no longer told stories about a giant or a frightening man. Instead, they were told where not to go. The explanation, if offered at all, was practical. There's nothing for you there. The warning carried no fear, only finality. A rare affidavit from 1892 describes a tall figure seen at dawn near the upper tree line. The witness, a timber cutter, emphasized that the figure did not move. It stood still long enough for him to count his own breaths, then turned away. The affidavit was filed without comment and never revisited. County maintenance logs show that trail markers near the ridge were repaired regularly, though no one could recall who performed the work. The stones were always set correctly. The paths never widened beyond necessity. The land appeared managed without a manager. By the middle of the decade, even speculation about the man's fate had faded. Whether he still lived, had died quietly, or had simply withdrawn entirely no longer mattered. The structure he left behind continued to function, and so the story entered its final phase, not disappearance, but persistence without witness. In the hills of Tennessee, the ridge remained exactly what it had become, settled, silent, and resistant to inquiry, not because it was guarded, but because it no longer needed to be. As the century neared its close, the ridge became a reference point rather than a subject. It was used to orient directions, before the ridge, beyond the ridge, but never as a destination. Even newcomers learned this language quickly, absorbing it the same way one learns where floods rise or frost lingers. In 1896, a courthouse fire destroyed several older volumes of land correspondence. Among the losses were letters from the years immediately following the man's escape. The clerk who cataloged the damage noted the absence without emotion. When asked whether the records should be reconstructed, he replied that there was nothing left to reconstruct. The matter resolved itself, he said. A traveling folklorist passing through eastern Tennessee collected stories of unusual local customs. He recorded a brief exchange with a farmer who explained why no one hunted the ridge after first snowfall. "Tracks do mean what they should up there," the farmer said. The folklorist assumed this referred to animals. Only later did he realize no animal had been mentioned. Medical records from the nearby town continued to show low levels of violent injury among those living closest to the high ground. A doctor remarked privately that conflicts seemed to lose momentum before reaching action. He offered no theory, only the observation that people behaved as if they were being quietly accounted for. Occasionally, someone suggested reopening the question of ownership. These suggestions never advanced. Meetings adjourned. Committees dissolved. The idea itself seemed to exhaust those who raised it. By then, The man had become inseparable from the ridge in memory. No one described him apart from it. He was not imagined walking into town or leaving the county. He existed only where he had first stood his ground. As winter returned, snow traced the contours of the high places and vanished again without disturbance. No new marks appeared. No absences were noted. The land remained unchanged, as it had for years. In Tennessee, where history often concluded not with answers but with habits, the ridge continued to hold its silence, unchallenged, unrecorded, and quietly instructive to those who passed nearby. By the turn of the century, the ridge had passed fully out of the realm of controversy and into something closer to agreement. Not an agreement written or spoken, but one enacted daily through avoidance, restraint, and repetition. The land did not need to be defended. It had already been accepted. A county assessor reviewing historical valuations in 1901 noted that the Caldwell tract had not changed status in decades. Neither improved nor degraded, he wrote. It persists. The word stood alone in the margin, underlined once. No explanation followed. Older residents who remembered the first years after the escape were now few. When asked about the man, they answered carefully, as if precision mattered even after so much time. One said, "He frightened people because he didn't ask." Another added, "He stayed when leaving was expected." None spoke of violence. None spoke of threats. A group of young men attempted to camp near the upper ridge that summer, dismissing older warnings as superstition. They returned before nightfall, shaken but unharmed. Their fire had been extinguished without ash scattered, their packs arranged in a line pointing downhill. They told no story beyond that. They never went back. County road crews continued to maintain routes below the ridge but did not extend them upward. Tools left overnight near the boundary were found in the morning stacked neatly and turned away from the climb. No one filed a report. The message was understood without needing to be read. The name Cheaha appeared occasionally in regional writings, usually in reference to elevation and isolation. None of the writers lingered. Several noted a sense of interruption, as though they had arrived somewhere mid-thought and were not meant to remain. By this point, the man's size, once the defining feature of every account, had faded into the background. What endured was the structure he left behind, a boundary held not by force but by collective memory. And so the ridge remained what it had been for nearly 30 years, quiet, resolved, and resistant to re-entry. In Tennessee, where history often settled into routine rather than record, that resistance proved more durable than any written claim. By the first decade of the new century, the ridge had become a fixed absence in official thought. It was not listed as dangerous, nor was it listed as protected. It simply did not invite classification. County reports referred to it only indirectly, if at all, as upper ground beyond regular use. A retired school teacher, interviewed in 1904 for a local history project, recalled how lessons had subtly changed over time. Early maps once showed the ridge in detail. Later versions reduced it to contour lines. "We stopped naming it," she said, "not because we forgot, but because naming felt unnecessary." A small group of hikers from outside the county attempted to reach the high ground that same year. They were experienced, well-equipped, and confident. They returned before dusk, unsettled by what they described as a loss of direction that could not be corrected. One said it felt as though the land refused continuation. None accused anyone of interference. They simply chose not to try again. Medical journals from the region continued to note the same pattern. Disputes among upland residents rarely escalated into injury. A physician writing anonymously suggested that people behaved as though consequences arrived before action. The idea was dismissed as philosophical rather than clinical. The man himself was almost never mentioned now. When he was, it was in the past tense that did not confirm absence. When he was there, people said, without finishing the thought. No one spoke of his death. No grave was known. No ceremony marked an end. A courthouse clerk attempting to digitize older records noted that several key documents related to the Caldwell land were missing entirely. There were no indications of theft. The pages simply were not there. The clerk wrote, "Loss predates my tenure," and moved on. By winter, snow fell lightly and melted quickly, leaving the ridge unchanged. No tracks were reported. No signs of passage were noted. Yet the routes below remained careful as they always had. In Tennessee's high country, the story had reached its final quiet form. Whatever had begun as an escape had settled into landscape. Whatever fear had followed had refined itself into restraint, and the ridge continued to hold, silent, accounted for, and unresolved, exactly as it had learned to do decades earlier. By 1910, the ridge had become something closer to an assumption than a location. It was present on maps, present in directions, present in memory, but absent from intention. No one planned around it. They planned away from it. A state historian compiling material on Tennessee's upland regions visited the county that year. He asked carefully about long-standing irregularities in land use. The answers he received were consistent and unhelpful. "That ground was never ours," one man said. Another replied, "It was settled before we arrived." Neither elaborated. The historian later wrote that the area represented a rare case in which social order outlasted its origin. He referenced the Reconstruction era only indirectly, noting that unresolved power structures sometimes concluded themselves without record. The passage was edited down in publication, stripped of implication. A final reported sighting surfaced in a private letter dated 1912. The writer described seeing a tall figure at great distance along the ridge line during a winter morning, standing still, then stepping back into the trees without haste. The writer did not claim recognition. He only wrote that the figure seemed where it belonged. No officials investigated. No affidavits were taken. The letter was folded and stored among family papers, never submitted to any authority. By this time, the plantation from which the man had once fled existed only as fragmented ownership and incomplete records. Its name carried no meaning. Its claim had long since expired without formal acknowledgement. The ridge, however, remained intact. Trails stopped where they always had. Paths curved as they always had. Children raised nearby continued to learn where not to go without being told why. In Tennessee, where the land often remembered what institutions forgot, that continuity was its own kind of resolution, one that did not require confirmation or closure. The file ends without final notation. There is no declaration of death, no reassignment of land, no closing summary. The last dated entry simply notes that the ridge remains unchanged. By 1917, the county had passed fully beyond the period in which the story could be actively pursued. Those who had witnessed its beginning were gone or silent. What remained was behavior, consistent, unquestioned, inherited. People still avoided the upper ground without urgency or fear. They did not say it was dangerous. They said only that there was no reason to go there. The distinction mattered. No marker identifies where the man once stood. No record confirms where he went or whether he ever left at all. Some believed he died quietly, absorbed into the hills he had claimed through endurance rather than force. Others believed the question itself misunderstood what had happened. The mountains of Tennessee offer no answers. They never did. They simply held what was placed upon them and kept it. And so the story closes where it began, in the high ground where a man once stood too tall to be ignored and too still to be challenged, where fear arrived not as violence but as recognition, where authority learned its limits without being told. The ridge remains silent, unresolved, and listening, holding the memory of a presence that never needed to announce itself and never fully departed.